Hey Lee, how you doing today?
I'm doing great, Billy. Great to see you and talk with you and your listeners as well.
So we obviously are here to talk about a lot of things. I absolutely love your story. And for those who don't know, you are the author of many books, but the book that sort of really kicked things off for you is The Case for Christ.
Yeah.
And The Case for Christ is also made into a feature film, which is streaming on Pure Flix. It's an amazing movie. It tells your story. And if people are not familiar with you, and I think most people in our audience are, you went from being a journalist and an atheist to a Christian, but not only a Christian, but I would say one of the most outspoken and talented, and the way you speak on faith is so incredibly touching. So you're a guy who's out there talking about faith now.
Yeah.
And I guess let's talk about your story. Okay.
Yeah.
You were, again, a journalist. You were the legal editor over at the Chicago Tribune, and you were an atheist. Describe your worldview at that time before becoming a Christian.
Well, I tend to be a logical person. You know, my background's in journalism and law. So I had a very logical, rational approach to my worldview, which is that if there is no God, if there is no heaven, if there is no hell, if there is no judgment, if there is no ultimate accountability, then the most logical way to live my life would be as a hedonist. And so that's what I did. Someone who just pursued pleasure. And so I lived a very immoral and drunken and profane and narcissistic, self-absorbed life. I mean, that was my life. I had great success in my career, but what people saw was me winning awards for investigative reporting. They didn't see the other side, which was me literally drunk in the snow in an alley on Saturday night.
And when you look back at that person now, right? And this is what I love about Christianity, this pivot point, what Jesus does in somebody's life. When you look back at who you were then, what goes through your mind now because of who you are now?
Yeah, it's such a radical transformation. I mean, my daughter, who was 5 years old when I came to faith, who when I would I would come home drunk and belligerent and angry, and her natural reaction was just to go in her bedroom and close the door. And when she was a toddler, after about 4 or 5 months of watching how God had changed my life and my values and my character, she came up to my wife and said, "I want God to do for me what he's done for Daddy." So even at age 5, she saw the transformation. Something's different with her dad. Something's new with her dad. And it's been in every area of my life, my worldview, my philosophy, my attitudes, my relationships, my priorities, my marriage, my parenting. I mean, all these things over time began to change for the good.
Well, and that's the thing. And I know you've talked about this in your work and you've written on this as well, but we talk about evidence for faith. And I think we get into these weird debates sometimes with atheists and other people. And it's like, well, the evidence, what you just described, your kid seeing your life change, that is the evidence collectively in billions, millions, at least right now, but billions of stories throughout the history of time of people who have been changed in this radical way. And it's not just words coming out of their mouth. It is an actual real change for them. And that's incredible.
Yeah, you're right, Billy. I mean, we tend to, when we think of evidence for the faith, we tend to think of scientific evidence, cosmology, physics, biochemistry. We think of historical evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. But the transformation of lives, I don't think can be discounted as a powerful bit of evidence for the truth of Christianity. I mean, I wrote a book called The Case for Grace, which is just full of stories about radical transformation through Jesus. So I think you're right. It does. Now, other religions can say, well, we have people who change too. But, when you combine the radical transformation of those who come to an authentic relationship with Christ with the scientific evidence, with the historical evidence, you've got a compelling case for the truth of Christianity.
And you have a volume of people, because that will often be the response. Well, lots of things change people. And that's true. Lots of things change people, but not at the volume and not to the extent that you have seen Christianity change people. At the least, an atheist would have to say, well, okay, this is compelling. There's something here. These people are changing. And to me, though, when you put that all together, as you just stated, it is absolutely incredible. So let's go back to your story, okay?
Yeah.
The beginnings of your story. Now, you're living this way before you become a Christian. Now, you're married and your wife goes through a transformation and your wife becomes a Christian. So, in that state that you were describing, what was it like? And I don't want to give the whole movie away, but I want to just talk about this because I think it's important. What
Yeah.
was it like for you watching your wife make that change and become a Christian?
Well, the first words that went through my mind when she told me she'd become a Christian was divorce. I was going to walk out. In fact, this is embarrassing, but she had just planted a big flower garden in our backyard, and it was time for me to mow the lawn. And I remember right after she told me she'd become a Christian, I was so mad. I went out and I mowed down her entire flower garden. About passive aggressive, but so I was angry, and yet in the following months, two things happened. In the positive sense, I saw positive changes in her character and her values, the way she related to me and the children. It was winsome, it was attractive, it kind of pulled me toward faith. But on the other hand, I wanted the old Leslie back. I wanted our old life back. And I thought, how can I rescue her from this cult that she's gotten involved in? And I figured the easiest way to do that would just be to disprove the resurrection, because I knew, even as an atheist, the resurrection was the key to Christianity. I'd seen a lot of dead people as a journalist at Chicago Tribune, and I never saw any of them come back after 3 days. So I thought, this can't be that hard to disprove the resurrection. And I launched on what turned out to be a nearly 2-year investigation of the evidence. And every time I would punch it, it was like one of those kids' punching bags. I don't know if you had one when you were a kid, where it was a clown, and you'd hit it, it would go back and it'd pop back up. It seemed like every time I would hit the evidence for the resurrection, it would bounce back up. And I said, doggone it, there's an answer to that, or there's another avenue to pursue. And I, after 2 years, just came to the conclusion that the evidence was so compelling that it would have taken me more faith to maintain my atheism than to become a Christian.
So you basically, I love that analogy of that. You think you're knocking it down every time, and it just comes right back at you.
Right in your face.
Right in your face. And you go on this journey, and the Case for Christ book, I mean, it's amazing to detail the journey you went on. It's a very, very intricate, the people you spoke with, the people you interacted with, the people you interviewed, to try to understand these different elements of faith. And it's remarkable to me to watch at the end of that you're so overwhelmed by the details, you become a Christian, right? The exact thing that you mowed those flowers down over, you end up embracing it. For you, as a person coming into that, from that worldview that you had, what changed in you and how long did that take? What was that process like?
It was a process. It took time. I was pretty entrenched in my worldview at that time. And so I'd say over the next 6 months to a year, people around me saw a difference. My children saw a difference. My daughter came to faith. And I think ultimately the people at the Chicago Tribune began to say something's going on with Strobel. I was just talking to one of my old colleagues at the Tribune, and he said, we thought you were going to become our boss. We thought you were going to become the editor eventually. And nobody thought you'd become a Jesus freak. They never said anything to me when I was there. But I heard behind my back, it was always like, what the heck happened to Strobel?
Like, what's going on? God had different plans, right, for you. And it's amazing. So you wrote the book, you've written many books, and at some point you decided, somebody came to you, and this idea to do a movie based on the book emerged, right? And this is why we have the Case for Christ movie. And there's a documentary, Case for Christ, as well, which is something different. And Case for Faith, I believe there's a couple of documentaries on some of your books, but this was a movie reenacting your life and the very personal details of you and your wife and her becoming a Christian. It goes deep into your story. And I want to talk about that film, but before we do that, I want to roll a clip. And this is a man who we actually had a chance at Pure Flix to interview about the impact that the movie had on his life. So I want to roll this clip, and then we'll talk a little bit about it, and we'll get into the movie.
I was just really broken because I think I was coming off of, a year or two of a failed marriage. When I fell off that cliff, just tumbling down and hit the bottom and then started to question. And around that same time, I did see A Case for Christ. I was searching so hard when I came into that movie theater, and I was ready to surrender. And I think I was kind of like him. I just came to a surrender, in my faith, where I was like, I can't disprove this. In fact, I think it's all real. That was pretty much what did it for me, that film. For me, it's like a story can reach us in a way that's eternal.
That was an amazing clip, getting a chance to see how, and I love the quote that he had that basically for him, that movie was it. Like watching the movie was that pivot point moment. What's it like for you to hear a story like that?
It's so awesome. It's so encouraging. And there've been so many of them. I get emails all the time from people who have similar stories. There was a church in New Zealand that rented a movie theater and showed the movie, and 22 people came to faith right there. I was in Des Moines, Iowa not long ago, right before COVID took hold. And I was speaking at a conference, and during a break, a pastor came up to me and he said, you know what my personal ministry is? I said, what? He said, when I meet someone who's not a Christian, I invite them over to my house for dinner. And then I say, let's watch this movie together. And we do. I said, well, that's a great idea. I said, what's the response been? He said, over 30 people have come to faith.
That's incredible.
It's incredible. God uses that film in ways that I never had anticipated. I remember when I sat down with Michael Scott, who is the president of Pure Flix, and when he said, why don't we do a movie? And I thought, really? I was kind of skeptical. But the amount, John Gunn, the director, and Brian Bird, the screenwriter, just went the extra mile to say, let's make this not a cringeworthy film that unfortunately too many faith films sometimes are, but let's make it a great film. And I remember when they showed me the rough cut of the movie and they said, what do you think? And I said, well, it's really good. And they said, nah, it's not good enough. And they went out, they showed it to a bunch of audiences, including non-believers, and got a bunch of feedback and went out and they probably filmed 10 new scenes.
Wow.
For the film. They didn't have to do that. It was a good movie before, but then it became a really great movie. And I thought, what a commitment to saying, we're going to do something here that's special. They spent the money, they took the time, and they created, I can't take credit for it. I didn't create it. I'm just thrilled the way that God uses it.
Well, you were open to what the plan that God had for you, which was long ago, first of all, writing the book, right? When you wrote the book, you probably had no idea this is going to be a movie. I mean, that probably wasn't even on your radar, right?
No,
I mean,
not at all.
Was it hard when that idea came up? And of course, if anybody hears we want to do a movie, it's exciting, right? But I would imagine there's a moment where you think, well, there's a lot of personal stuff here. Is this something, because it's a little different from the book in that I feel like it goes much deeper into what was going on in personal relationships. So what was that process like of making that decision to really open yourself up in that way?
Well, what I never realized is that when you kind of give away your life story to a movie maker, you lose all control. In other words, and which makes sense, because if they gave me the ultimate control to say yes or no, and they go out and they spend millions of dollars and time to create this movie, and they come to me and I say, nah, I don't like it, forget it. That's not going to work. So you contractually really have no control over the movie. On the other hand, I negotiated part of the contract where I got to choose the screenwriter. And I chose Brian Bird, who's written 17 movies, fantastic screenwriter, and he's a good friend of mine. And I knew Brian would protect my story. And so we spent hours and days with Brian, Leslie, and I sitting with him and talking about the intimate parts of our marriage and about how this whole ordeal of this 2 years when she was a committed Christian and I was a committed atheist, the clashes that we had, the problems that we had. And we were very honest with him. And he protected our story. He presented it with integrity, and not that the movie is exactly, it's a 90-minute movie, and in order to create a 90-minute movie, you've got to have some time shifting, you got to have some composite characters, but it is about 85% accurate. in terms of which is incredibly high for a based on a story film. So we are thrilled the way it came out. And Pure Flix was so good. At the end, they called me up and they said, Lee, we're about to lock the film, which means that's it. It's done. Do you have any hesitations? Do you have anything you're concerned about? We'll make whatever changes you want. That's awesome. They didn't need to do that, but they were committed to saying, let's do something with high integrity. Let's do it with as much skill as we can, as much art as we can. And let's create a film that speaks to people's souls as well as to their minds.
Well, and we saw that in the video, and you've gotten emails, as you were saying about this, that this is a story that is changing people's lives. And it's incredible. I mean, it's incredible to see that. Now, I'm going to ask you a faith question, because a couple of different faith questions. Going back to that journey when you finally concluded that Christianity is real, that this evidence is pointing to something that is true. What was that final thing for you that made that convincing argument?
I think, it's a cumulative case. So there wasn't one fact that kind of clinched it for me, but there was one final piece of the puzzle. And that was, my argument against Christianity and against the idea that the disciples, had encountered the risen Christ. I would say, the fact that they were willing to die for this, what actually happened to them gets a little bit lost in history, but their willingness to die is well established by 7 ancient sources. But I said, well, so what? Lots of terrorists throughout history have been willing to die for their faith. Kamikaze pilots in World War II crashed their airplanes into boats because they thought they'd go to paradise if they did that. There are terrorists these days who will kill themselves in the course of a terrorist act, thinking and believing that they will go to paradise to be with God if they do that. So I thought, so what that the disciples lived lives of deprivation and suffering and were willing to die for their conviction that Jesus had appeared to them. And then somebody pointed out the difference. The difference is, let's take a terrorist today. A terrorist says, I'm going to crash an airplane into a building. Why would he do that? Why would he die that way? Because he sincerely believes with all of his heart, if he dies that way, he'll go to paradise. Does he know for a fact? Well, no, he can't know for a fact. He just believes it. He has faith in it, and he's willing to do it. In contrast, the disciples of all human beings who've ever lived in history were in a unique position to know for a fact whether Christianity was true or a lie, whether Jesus returned from the dead or if he didn't. They were there. They touched them. They talked with them. They ate with them. They were in the unique position to know whether this was true or whether it wasn't. And knowing it was true, they were willing to die for it. That's the difference. And that's huge. And that was kind of the final aha moment I had, that, they were willing to die for it, not because of their faith in it, but because of the fact of it. They were there. They knew the truth. And as I say, we have 7 ancient sources of their willingness to die and living a life of deprivation and suffering as a result of their proclamation that Jesus had risen. So that was kind of the final piece. And then Leslie pointed out a verse to me, John 1:12, that says, but as many as received him, to them he gave the right to become children of God, even to those who believe in his name. And I noticed that verse has, if you take the active verbs out of that verse, it forms an equation of what it means to become a child of God. Believe plus receive equals become. So I said, okay, I get it. I believe, based on the data of history, that Jesus claimed to be the Son of God, that he backed it up by returning from the dead. I believe it based on the facts. But that wasn't enough. I had to receive. Receive what? Receive this free gift of forgiveness and eternal life that Jesus purchased for me on the cross when he died as my substitute to pay for all of my sin. And when I'd receive this free gift of his grace, then I would become a child of God. And that's where that moment in the film where I get on my knees and in real life, I poured out a confession of a lifetime of immorality that would absolutely curl your hair. And at that moment received complete and total forgiveness through Jesus Christ and became a child of God.
I love it. And that is so powerful. And for anybody who is tuning in right now or listening right now, we're talking about The Case for Christ with Lee Strobel. You can watch the movie on Pure Flix right now. So one final question, and it's a big question to end with, but it's something because I love what you just delivered, and I love the apologetics that you do and getting people to think deeper on scripture and noticing things that maybe we miss sometimes and pointing us to them. I notice with atheists a lot, one of the big, and even Christians who are struggling with their faith and going through doubt, one of the big objections that people will say is, well, why did Jesus have to die? Like, why couldn't have God? He's God. He could do it another way. Like, why did it require this difficult, gruesome death? And I know that's a big question to kind of conclude with, but I wanted to throw that to you because this is obviously a season. Last week, was Easter, and this is something people have been thinking about. So how would you respond to that very big question?
Yeah, I mean, it is a big question, but I think it fundamentally makes total sense when you think about it. For instance, there's a payment made when we do something wrong, when we harm another person. And I'll give you an example. Let's say you borrow my car, and when you return it, it's got a huge scratch along the side of the car. Now, I could just say, I forgive you, and you'd say, oh, thank you, and walk away. But then I have to pay for the repair of the car. Either I'm going to pay for the repair of the car, or I'm going to pay as a reduced price when I go to sell the car. There is a price to be paid. And in the case of Jesus, he said, I will pay the price. I will pay the death penalty that you deserve for the sins that you've committed. I will pay that and offer that payment as a free gift of my grace, so that you can be forgiven, so that you can spend eternity with me. So I think it makes sense that he would be our substitute to pay for the sins that we've committed and offer forgiveness as a gift of his God. That's an expression of God's love. So sin has to be paid for. It's like paying for the scratch in the car. Somebody's going to pay for it. Either I'm going to pay for it for eternity, which is eternal separation from God, or Jesus is going to pay for it on my behalf and offer forgiveness as a gift that I need to receive, as we've talked about. I would much rather receive that free gift of his forgiveness than pay for the penalty of my sins forever.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you so much for breaking that down. And thank you so much for writing The Case for Christ, for giving your story over to be told into a movie form. And again, anybody watching, you can check the movie out on Pure Flix. Appreciate your time today.
Thank you, Billy. I love what you do. And thanks for the opportunity to speak to your viewers.